If I had a sixpence for every person who said Albie Sachs needs no introduction, and then has gone on to give an introduction, I could retire if I wanted to retire, but I don't want to retire. Ruth died at her desk as a professor, an intellectual, a person who believed in ideas, who believed in research, who believed in critique, debate. She had just presided over a United Nations-sponsored seminar at the Eduardo Mondlane University, dealing with transformation of the countryside in recently independent Mozambique, opening the mail, and boom. We know now even some of the details of who sent that parcel through the South African Truth Commission. She was murdered, targeted because she was an intellectual, because she dealt with that dangerous material called ideas. Ideas that could be liberatory, transformatory, challenging, awkward, difficult, sometimes presented in a rasping, searing, even dismissive way, sometimes with wit, with humor, but always centered on a vision, a heart, an intelligence, totally dedicated to the deepest ideas of enlightenment, of knowledge, serving emancipation, enabling people to be more human, to be freer. It was a very strange institution. You'll hear more about it later today, Centre for African Studies. To my mind, possibly the most extraordinary and in many ways the most successful research institution in the world in the 20th century. It was a product of happenstance much more than intention. Ruth became an academic because she had to earn a living so that she could write books. And she looked around, what job could she do? She could become an academic. She didn't have that vacation from the days when she was studying herself, one day I'm going to be an academic. And the big advantage of that meant that when she came in with rich, intense life experience, testing, questioning on the one hand, but a freshness and a vigor that benefited enormously from the discipline, the structures, the organizations that academia could provide. She was a marvelous teacher, a great researcher, a terrific supervisor, and she ended up in Mozambique shortly after the revolutionary achievement of independence there. And her co-worker, head of the Centre for African Studies, I like to say it in Portuguese, Centro dos Estudos Africanos, was Aquino Braganza, also an academic by happenstance, from Goa, linking up in Paris at the Sorbonne with people from Frelimo, becoming a full-time activist, head of the Centre for African Studies. You couldn't have had two more contrasting styles of intellectual leadership. Aquino was genial, congenial, warm, friendly. There's nothing he loved more than a good discussion. His idea of the ideal intellectual circumstance was to get 2, 3, 4 brilliant thinkers in a room and get them talking. Ideas pursuing ideas, the dialectic existing in its own sphere of internal logic and coherence and persuasiveness. And he loved getting people from Sorbonne and other parts of Europe trained in that intellectual mode of reasoning from basic principles together to find different forms of understanding the world we live in. Ruth had a much more pragmatic, fact-based approach to ideas, to test, to verify, to confirm. Aquino would invite these brilliant people for a seminar. Ruth would plan for the team to go out and do research in the countryside. And the planning meant everything from petrol to the beans, to the meetings you would have in the evening, to the research you would do beforehand, going through all the literature, to the feedback afterwards, down to every little detail. Sometimes more for purposes of alliteration than of truth, I would say she's a product of Lenin and the LSE. And they made a marvelous combination. And in that dialectic between them, those two styles of work, this very extraordinary Centre for African Studies emerged. Contradiction lay at the heart of the whole endeavour. They were established to do independent scientific research as part of the revolutionary transformation in Mozambique. How can you be critical, objective, telling, pursuing truth, even if it's framed within the overall matrices, the logic of a revolutionary perspective on the world, on the one hand, and be supportive of the revolutionary transformation on the other? And the way they resolved that was to say precisely, discovering realities in ways or means of describing realities, putting it together in coherent form, feeding it into the revolutionary process would not be, however critical it was, would not be anti-revolutionary. It would strengthen the processes. It would provide a counterweight, a check. It would compel people to analyze and debate what they were doing. It was the antidote to a sloganized reality and a intellectually impoverished, routinized way of conducting affairs, doing things, imagining your country, and trying to inspire people. So that very tension between being critical on the one hand and being loyal on the other hand became a source of strength if it was properly managed. And to me, the whole life of Ruth is best understood in terms of a term that she used in relation to dealing with the peasantry. I imagine the archive has that last talk that she gave. It was recorded, and it's been played occasionally at meetings like this. I choke up when I just hear her voice, speaking with that special timbre that she had, the confidence. And she was saying, refuting the whole approach that Aquino had of intellectuals discussing the peasantry as a category. She would say, there isn't such a thing as the peasantry. There are contradictions amongst the peasants. There are male peasants and female peasants. There are peasants close to the water and peasants in dry areas. There are peasants who employ labor and peasants who simply rely on the family. And we must go out there and discover the contradictions and tell the contradictions. Her very, very last presentation was about the contradictions. And at the ceremony we had a couple of days after her death at the Centre for African Studies, I found the most honest way I could respond to Ruth was to deal with the contradictions in her own life and how she managed them. The contradiction of a white person in an overwhelmingly black movement. And not only overwhelmingly black in numbers statistically, but the very nature of the struggle was against a form of oppression that was associated with origin, skin color, culture, everything connected with being black. And Ruth's response to that was not to somehow try to diminish the fact that she was white, to almost or figuratively paint herself as not being white, but to use all the advantages that being white gave her in terms of access to education, to travel, to ideas, to feed them into the movement, so that the benefits that she got automatically associated with her skin color were benefits now that she shared with everybody. And so that contradiction then became a beneficial contradiction. And she was appreciated for that. Similarly, a woman of relatively comfortable means, middle-class background, in a movement dedicated to socialism, the rights of the workers. Again, she didn't dress poor. She loved presenting herself in a well-turned-out way. And I would hear people who were poor in the movement appreciating that she's not trying to prove I'm with the masses and I wear torn clothing. If the masses had access, they would dress nicely and neatly. She had access, she did that. But again, she used the style, the skills, the things that she got because she was a bit better off, to feed into the struggle for everybody, to share with everybody, and resolved that contradiction. And wasn't an awkward person in a people's movement wondering what will they think of me. She was who she was, confidently and publicly, and because her outlook was so passionate, her commitment was so clear, her intelligence was so well directed, she was appreciated as part of the breadth of that wonderful movement. It was part of that vision of the way South Africa will be one day for everybody. The third contradiction, a woman in a largely male-dominated movement. She never fully resolved that contradiction. It's very strange. People who knew Ruth would see this compelling, independent, spirited person. She took on men at the level of theory. Theory was the ultimate domain, if you like, of masculine domination, not just the guns. And she took them on at the level of theory. Combative. But inside there was something dissatisfied, a sense of inadequacy. It comes out in her letters. It comes out in all sorts of ways. In the book she co-authored on Olive Schreiner, the brilliant South African author who had that same sense, in spite of enormous public acceptance and achievement, something hadn't fully been worked out in her life. That was what I said outside the Centre for African Studies. Today, it's 30 years on, and a new set of contradictions clamor for attention. And I was thinking, why is it, preparing for this occasion, Ruth was brilliant. We're commemorating the life of somebody who was spectacular in intellectual terms. Old comrades are getting together. We're with each other. It's marvelous. That sense of reconnection is very special. We have this marvelous archive. But something inside me is not celebrating. And I'm thinking, why? And it's not simply death of a comrade, because many people died in our struggle. Some were tortured to death, some were executed, some because of conditions under which they had to live. There's something about the death of Ruth first that has a sense of extreme poignancy that I find to this day is still very disturbing. And I've been trying to discover what is that source. It's not simply she was a woman who was murdered by men sending a bomb to her. It's something to do with that. It shouldn't be okay to murder men, but not okay to murder women in the name of defending apartheid or whatever it might be. I think our imaginations are masculinized in that sense. We see the male hero going into combat, accepting the risk of being killed. And if the woman takes up a gun, then she enters into that masculine role on an equal basis. Somehow the idea that they selected a woman as a target. But that can't just be the basis for the sense of horror that remains to this day. I think, to me, what made it so especially shocking is that she was killed because she was an intellectual. And the fact that she was a woman highlighted that aspect, not as a combatant part of Umkhonto we sees were struggling for the physical destruction of the South African military. She was killed at her desk. She was killed because of her ideas. It was a targeting of a person who was seen as a threat. Samora Machel once said when Mozambique was accused of having secret weapons, he said, our secret weapon is Ruth First. Because she stood for following the truth, for transformation, for change, for a future non-racial, transformed, revolutionized South Africa. And that was seen as something terrifying, something that had to be blotted out. And I suspect that's part of the reason why there's that sense of dismay. It's not that you get any form of immunity because you're an intellectual, but somehow that makes it a more vicious kind of attack. But there's still something more. And the tentative conclusion I've come to is that it marked not just the death of a revolutionary, but looking back, for many of us, it's the death of revolution. Not that her death meant the revolution didn't succeed, but Ruth was killed at a time when many of the people in this room would say, if you were asked, what are you, you'd say, I am a revolutionary. No one today says, I am a revolutionary. I've been accused of being a counter-revolutionary. What's happened? And Ruth was part of that world of intense idealism. There are lots of people who are politically active, very active today. It's not the same thing. The revolutionary had a vision of not just making the world a better place, not just dealing with injustice here and there, or even powerful injustice, but of transforming the very structures of the world, of a country, of a place, of the whole world, of liberation in a very systemic, organized and directed way. That was one aspect. The other aspect was you were total. You were available 24 hours a day, committed to the revolution. It didn't mean some revolutionaries laughed, they had fun, they enjoyed life. Other revolutionaries were doer. It didn't mean you were doer 24 hours a day, but it meant you were on call all the time. And we don't have that now. We have very, very committed people who, the phrase is used, burn themselves out after a short period of time or a longer period of time. It's different. And we're living in a different world. Because that world of intense idealism and expectation, the idea of transforming the world in the way that we had there and we lived through there, and we used to speak about the Mozambican Revolution and envisage revolutionary transformation of the whole world. That world is gone. And Ruth went at that stage. She didn't evolve slowly through the different phases in the way all of us have done. I'm still baffled. I still find a contradiction between the intense commitment we had in those days and the fruitful, active, valuable lives we're leading now. There's a disconnect. Conceptually, a huge disconnect. What we used to call theory is in disarray. And even emotionally and conceptually, existentially, there's a disconnect. Ruth used to call me soft-centered, and I'm going to prove that she's right. Looking back now, we've lost the epic. We've lost the nobility, the grandeur of that total commitment. But we've also lost the tunneled vision, the incapacity to handle diversity, subtleties, nuances, contradictions, a kind of openness, if you like. We're much more available to a pluralistic and uncertain vision of the world. Before, we were searching all the time for certainty. And there was something marvelous about that. Now, I think very few of us are searching for certainty. In the field of justice, Amartya Sen has put it, I think, very elegantly. Instead of trying to create an ideal system of justice, which others might try and do, he said, I see injustice and I deal with it in different ways. I mitigate the amount of injustice in the world. And I think many of us are settling for that or comfortable with that. We negotiated our revolution in South Africa. I believe it has been a revolution, and profound transformations have taken place. I believe at the same time it's massively incomplete. The revolutionary transformation itself is filled with contradictions. But the response has to be, how do we manage and understand and discern those contradictions in a way that can be fruitful? Let me wrap up. I think each one of us will have a slightly personal response to Ruth and the meaning of today. I wish I could stay to hear all the different presentations. There's a marvelous, wonderful array of people who have in common not only that they all worked with Ruth at a different stage, but they were all part of that endeavor that I've been speaking about. That was very rich and very meaningful and very, very productive. Two certainties I think I can leave you with. The one is Ruth would have been very proud of her daughters. I believe they are cooperating with this project. I was thrilled to hear that. And there are three strong, independent, spirited, creative, lovely people. And the other is she would have been thrilled to bits. I can say that it's a stupid thing to imagine. What would Ruth be saying about this, that, and the other? But that's one certainty I can offer. She'd be thrilled to bits at the idea of this project. Not for her vanity, because she wasn't vain in that sense. She was never self-promoting. If anything, she beat down on herself too much. But for the scientific value. For the idea that the endeavors of so many people, the things she penned, that she debated, the debates and arguments that she had, the books that she wrote, are being collected. And that's where the new contradiction arises. In this hall, there are two. We're all in the same hall, we're not in the same space. Some of us occupy the space of memory, association, with Ruth, that period, those endeavors, those ideals. Others have come along because you've heard she's a brilliant person who's made a contribution, she can be exemplary. They are different spaces, emotionally, existentially. It's the tension, contradiction between those two spaces, if you like, that will give a vitality and a meaning. We've got to let go, our generation. Our function is to help gather all the material and then allow a new generation to interpret it and develop it and add to it and critique it with that same vigor that Ruth always used. My very last words, I heard about the film by Jack Gold. It's a beautiful film. Ruth and I had extraordinary parallels, in jail, out of jail at the same time, each writing a book about solitary confinement. Hers was called 118 Days. I sent her the manuscript of mine. I called mine 168 Days. She didn't tell me why she couldn't get a publisher herself, but she passed me on to somebody who got a publisher. A film was made by the BBC, by Jack Gold. It's a beautiful film, and it has a marvelous person playing the lead role, Ruth First. You'll see Ruth speaking, telling her story herself. And the sequel to that, and maybe you could consider this, and I'm always offering advice unsolicited, but I'm not going to stop now. The film A World Apart. Barbara Hershey, it's written by Ruth's daughter, Sean. A very beautiful film, a marvelous film at that time. What it's like to be the daughter of somebody who's devoted her life to the struggle. What about me? What's the connection between? Very beautifully done. And Barbara Hershey has the hairstyle that Ruth had in the film, the voice, the posture, and everything. So you have something very, very beautiful to look forward to when that is out. And I think we're going to have an extraordinary day with marvelous minds and rich hearts to share ideas with us. Thank you.